Hello, welcome to hands-on-sap.com. This is Hassan Mir. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about a workflow in a typical SAP project. Okay, so we already know that there are three environments in a company: development, test and QA, and production. So we already know the concept of a client. A client is a partition within an SAP environment. You can have multiple clients and data is going to be protected within a client. So if you're connected to client 1, you cannot see data sitting in client 2. So one client basically represents a company, but the same concept is used to create partitions within one environment. Okay, so client is a partition within an SAP installation. So typically you would create three clients in a development environment: configuration, sandbox, and development test. And you would have three clients in a test or QA box, namely QA testing, training 1 and training 2, and if more training clients are required, that could be created here as well. And production typically contains one real client representing the actual company, okay, and that client would call a production. Okay, so more than one client are created in an installation to help carry on with implementation project, and that's what we're going to see in this tutorial, how creating multiple clients would help you carry on with your implementation project. So majority of the implementation work takes place in the development box, that is the first box here. At least 3 clients are created in dev box. More than 3 could be created if need be. Okay, so configuration ideas and theories are tested in the sandbox client. So sandbox client is the starting point if necessary, if consultants need to see or experiment a what-if situation or some kind of idea testing has to be done. That would take place in a sandbox. Okay, so that's gonna be your starting point if sandbox is required. Otherwise, configuration can directly takes place in the configuration box as well. Now, once you're comfortable with the configuration in your sandbox client, you repeat all your configuration settings in the configuration client. Okay, so actually this is your main starting point, configuration client, but if you need a sandbox environment just to play around, then you would start with the sandbox. Now, configuration client is also known as a transport client. Why? Because configuration is moved from here to all other SAP environments. Okay, so that's why it's also called a transport client. And the way configuration is moved is moved through a feature called a transport feature in SAP. It's a vehicle to move configuration from one client to the other. Now, configuration client is also kept clean of any transactional data like journals and invoices, etc., or any transactional data. Why? Because its configuration is going to be copied over from here to other clients. So tables data will be copied over, and you don't want any transactional data to go to the other clients. Just the configuration sits in the configuration client. Okay, it's pure of any transactional data. Now, configuration settings are transported to the development test client. Okay, so the development team or the consultants, they basically create their own testing within this dev box in the development test client. So this is the step number 3. Configuration is moved over to this dev test client, and now you can enter transactional data and make this client dirty, but no transaction data is entered in the configuration client. Now, usually once the configuration has been copied over using the transport vehicle, development team would do testing in the client 103, development test client. Okay, now unit testing is performed here, and sometimes integration testing is also performed in this client. Now, unit test is basically testing of one module, and integration test is you test all modules together to see if they're working together or not, because testing modules individually doesn't guarantee that they would work together, because there are interfaces between the modules. Now, after the testing, if you need to make more changes in the configuration, you're going to go back to the configuration client and you're going to do some adjustments and make more changes and repeat the testing if need be. So this is going to be iterations going on back and forth. Now there will be a point when you're going to say, okay, our configuration looks 100% perfect. Now it's the time to move your configuration settings or transport your configuration settings to QA testing client. Okay, that's number one client in your test box. Now this is where the final testing is going to be conducted before your system goes to production. Now UAT testing takes place, as well as integration tests are done here as well. Now UAT stands for user acceptance testing. Okay, so users basically sign off saying that they're happy with the system. If they're not happy, then you're going to go back to the configuration client, make more configuration changes and transport them back to the QA, and you're going to repeat the testing until users are happy. Normally integration testing takes place at the QA box, but optionally you can also do the integration testing in the dev box, or you can do the integration testing on both places, dev box as well as in the QA box. At least one QA client is created in a QA box. More than one QA client could be created if necessary. If there are more than one testing team testing the environment, then you can do that as well. And now configuration settings are adjusted again if users are not happy with the system, and once you have done the configuration, you're going to move it back again to the testing environment. So again, table driven customization is the key here. Since all the data configuration setting is stored in the database, not in the actual code, it's very easy to go back and change the configuration and promote the configuration back to test environment. It's not like custom applications where you have to rewrite the program if the testing fails and users need new features, etc. One or more training clients are created in the test box as well. Now training clients are used to train end users. Once they are happy with the system and you are about to promote it to production, they need to be trained properly in how to use the system. And if you are conducting more than one training session, you can create more than one training client as well. Now configuration settings are transported from configuration client to the training client, of course, just like they're transported to any other client. So this is the main source of transporting configuration settings out to any other client. Configuration client is the main source. Now testing is conducted, and finally configuration settings are transported to production client, and this is where day-to-day business transactions take place. Now just keep this in mind, Sandbox and configuration client are the only two clients where access to configuration tables should be allowed. Okay, so this is the only two clients where configuration can take place, and none of the other clients should be allowed to have their configuration tables changed. Now because configuration settings are going to be copied over or transported over from configuration client to everywhere else. Now rest of the client would simply receive configuration settings from the configuration client through transport mechanism, as I have been repeating this many times already in this tutorial. Now this is the sum and substance of your of this tutorial. Now you start with the sandbox, you play with the sandbox if you need to do some experiments. Finally you do your test configuration in the configuration client. Now this configuration is moved over to the dev test client, where you do your own testing, and if you're happy with your testing, then you're going to copy configuration from configuration client over to the QA client, and you do your QA testing here. If your testing team is happy and users do their testing as well here, if they're happy, then you're going to copy the configuration from the configuration client to the training, and you do your training, and then you copy the configuration from configuration client to the production. So this is the main source. Now users do the configuration only at Sandbox and configuration client. They are not allowed to touch any configurations on any other client. Now another thing to note, that when users do their experiments and some testing in that Sandbox, they are not allowed to copy configuration over to configuration client. The configuration has to be repeated manually in the configuration client. So technically this is your starting point. This is just a play area. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this tutorial, and I'm going to see you in my next tutorial.